We're going to show you that we're actually coming to the same geometry. We're arriving at the same structure as what quantum gravity does, but in a completely intuitive, natural geometric fashion.
I'm here with Joe Truss, and we are going to discuss a video, Klee Irwin's 20-group twist. And so we're looking at loop quantum gravity. And let's get right into the video. And then if you want to give a little bit of background as we even just look at the image at the start of this video.
Right. Yeah, so loop quantum gravity uses a geometric approach as well to the foundations of the universe. And their structure is built on the tetrahedron. And so from this point of view, if that is the case, the edge length of a tetrahedron is the Planck distance. So that is the connection between Book of Codes and loop quantum gravity, between our natural geometry and the deep mathematics that comes out of loop quantum gravity. And so we want to just show you a bit of Klee's video in terms of how they construct their model out of 20 tetrahedra. And then we'll show an alternative method just using geometry, but to achieve essentially the same thing.
And we're basing this on the idea that we live in a tetraverse. And there is a full video that we have that is a really good introduction to that. But let's get right into this video.
Right.
The fundamental representative geometry of the quasi-crystalline spin network is a group of 20 tetrahedra. So to think about this, we can start with the E8 crystal. The E8 crystal can be thought of as the maximum density packing of 8-dimensional spheres. In the same way we would stack oranges in the supermarket is the maximum density that we can pack those spheres. So we take this very special lattice in 8 dimensions, and we take a slice of it and we project it to 4 dimensions, where we get a quasi-crystal that is made entirely of regular 3D tetrahedra. But each tetrahedron lives in a different 3-dimensional space next to its neighbor, in the same way that the different faces of a cube live in different 2-dimensional spaces.
Let's pause there, Dave. Right, so that figure on my left, the bunch of tetras, looks like a Sierpinski, looks like a fractal thing. But that is what tells us that, in fact, it's a tetrahedral basis, the loop quantum gravity whole system. Not just that they start with 20 tetrahedra, but when you look at that grid, that's a perfect tetrahedral grid, right? They build their spaces in that grid in a different way than we would. And so you can continue from here. And in fact, essentially one last thing is this form is a hexagon. If you look at the outside form, it is a hexagon, which is essentially a very, very deep representation of our geometry as well.
And we're looking at it from a perspective of being able to see one face of a tetrahedron. Because if you look at this, what you're seeing is flat triangles. But if you were to turn this one way, you would get by
different plane of faces.
You would get a new face. It would look exactly like this, but from another face. And you can do that in 4 different directions, because this is not a flat image. This is a representation from one perspective, looking at tetrahedrons, not just triangles.
From the other faces of the cube. So around any one point in this 4-dimensional quasi-crystal that comes from E8, there are 20 of these regular 3D tetrahedra. And their convex hull that would encapsulate them is a regular 3-dimensional icosahedron. So it's an icosahedron segmented by 20 regular tetrahedra. But in 3 dimensions, we have the quasi-crystalline spin network. What's interesting is that in 3 dimensions, these regular tetrahedra cannot close up. So in 4D, we can take 20 of them, and they all kiss faces, and they share vertices, and they share edges. So around every edge in this 4-dimensional space, there are 5 regular tetrahedra. And around every point or vertex, there are 20 regular tetrahedra. And in 3D, This is not the case. When you keep all 20 in 3D and each of the 20 tetrahedra have their center vertex coincident or shared with the 19 others, there's gaps that open up. And if you evenly distribute those gaps so that you space these 20 tetrahedra around the shared point at the center, you'll have these 30 gaps. But
let's talk a little bit about those 30 gaps and the necessity for them.
Yes. So if you take 20 tetrahedra and you put them with their vertices at one point in the middle of this sphere, you can't pack them together fully. And the reason is because the edge length of the tetrahedron is equal, but the diameter, the radius of an icosahedron is a compressed edge length. So if you try to stick a larger edge length into it, you're going to have the 20 faces with gaps, which is exactly what he's showing, right? So that's 20 tetrahedra packed together, and you have these automatic gaps. That's derived from the quasi-crystal coming from the E8, but we can reconstruct this in just straight three-dimensional geometry without any reference. Now, you'll see later that the reason that I think loop quantum gravity works with this model is they're working in something called a Minkowski space, where all of the mathematics of that is already defined. In our case, we're taking a purely geometric model, and basically what we need now is the mathematical and the algebra and the equations that would define that. We're going to show you that we're actually coming to the same geometry. We're arriving at the same structure as what loop quantum gravity does, but in a completely intuitive, natural geometric fashion.
Right. And one of the key things is when you're looking at the way these tetrahedron combine, right, it's necessary to have those spaces. It's necessary to go from another dimension into our three-dimensional world with these spaces, because they do not fit in our universe unless you change from sort of the icosahedral and the tetrahedral shapes and look specifically at a cube octahedron. And that's something I think we need to address specifically when looking at this. But let's continue on with the video first.
between the faces of the tetrahedra. Each tetrahedron has 4 different planes, 4 different equilateral triangle faces. So when you take 20 tetrahedra, then you have a total of 80 of these 2-dimensional faces. Now, normally when you have them evenly spaced in this 20 group with the gaps, you would have 40 parallel classes of these triangular faces, and they do not touch. So if you want them to touch, you rotate the faces of the tetrahedra, which rotates each entire tetrahedron, by a special golden ratio angle, which comes ultimately from the 4-dimensional space of this 4-dimensional quasi-crystal. And when you do that rotation, you have to make a choice of right or left. So you have to rotate them all right or all left, or they'll crash. So let's say you rotate all of them right by this golden ratio angle. What happens is all the faces then kiss, and they splay or separate, but they kiss. And what happens is these 40 plane classes collapse to only 10 plane classes. This is important for the physics that we use because we follow Minkowski's theorem, where what is important is the number of ratios in a network of objects and the number of parallel line classes.
Let's pause there and go back to this shape right here. Here we go. Okay, so we're going to explore this shape a little bit, and let's just switch screens here to a little PowerPoint we've created. Okay, so here it is. You want to talk a little bit about it?
Right. So in this case, what you see is that everywhere 2 edges of tetrahedra meet, that's actually a Fibonacci point.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So that they get that from the Fibonacci angle, but it gives you on the one edge of the tetrahedron That's the Fibonacci relationship between the small end and the big end. So what's happening here is that if I took a dodecahedron, we haven't talked about that, but that is the dual of the icosahedron, which is 12 pentagonal faces together. And so at every one of those pentagonal faces, 3 edges come together, where 3 pentagons come together. If I cut that off, it's called an Archimedean thing. I cut it off at a certain level, I get a triangle sitting between these 3 pentagons. This is what this form is doing. This form is basically slicing off the corner of every pentagonal vertex of the dodecahedron, and that creates, now you can show me the next figure. There we go. So this triangle comes out of the fact that I've cut through the pentagonal vertices of a dodecahedron, which come together in 3 lines. And when I cut that through, I get the triangle.
Yeah.
Right? And so show the next one. Exactly. So every triangle here is surrounded, every edge of the triangle is surrounded by a pentagon. So there are 3 pentagons around that central triangle. And in fact, if you continue the array of triangles, the whole system is this interaction between pentagons and tetrahedra, which is a 3-dimensional solid object in our 3-dimensional space. It's not a quasi-crystal re-represented in form, which is needed mathematically for loop quantum gravity. But for us, we just work on the basis of the tetrahedral edge is your primary, what we call unit 1, the smallest, which is that Planck distance. And if we build our structures up from that tetrahedron, we come to very similar processes without having to go to the quasi-crystal.
Now, looking at this from a geometer brain and not understanding, loop quantum gravity, I don't have the mathematical background. But when I look at this crystal they've created, to me, it seems extremely unstable because of the way that the triangles connect with each other. They're neither on a face, right, on an edge length, or connected through the vertices. They're connected in very unstable way around each other. But if you look in our universe and you look at a dodecahedron, you're saying, here's a very stable form created by pentagons and triangles to create the shape, which structurally intact and do not require moving from another dimension to this dimension in order to have the description to create it. We can create it simply out of a tetrahedral universe where everything is constructed out of basic tetrahedral shapes.
That's right. And so maybe they show, I haven't seen this, maybe they show mathematically that they can expand that structure, that sphere, omnidirectionally in every direction, which would represent the expansion of the universe as we know it, creating the flat space. But again, I don't know that. But looking at that model, I would say that it would distort. Because I know that there's only one model that does not distort, and it's the cube octahedron, which is triangles and squares around each other, not pentagons, right? Yeah. And so what I'm glimpsing, like you, I'm not a mathematician, I'm a natural geometer. I'm looking at the mathematics, the Minkowski space, the stuff that he's describing that brought them to this shape. And I'm saying, as a natural geometer, that shape exists for me without the mathematics, but it does the same thing. It has the same logical consistency. And the most important part of that to us is that loop quantum gravity believes that the edge length of the tetrahedron they use is the Planck distance. And we have a way to show that if that is in fact the case, if they are correct, the cube octahedron is the only form that allows you to actually not violate by making a radius that's shorter than the edge length. And there's only one form in existence where the radius of the sphere and the edge length are equal, and that is the cube octahedron. And so we would go backwards from the cube octahedron to the icosa, as opposed to going from 20 tetrahedron through this amazing kind of mathematical transformation. We can show you a far more natural way, mechanically, in terms of seeing an object do just that.
Right. And we did that in a video called We Live in a Tetraverse that I'll link to here.
Right.
Because we follow Minkowski's theorem, where what is important is the number of ratios in in a network of objects and the number of parallel line classes. And so here we collapse to the minimum possible in this configuration, and where the edges cross on this group of 20 tetrahedra, it divides the edge of a tetrahedron into the golden ratio. And if you were to rotate it the opposite direction, it would divide each edge into the golden ratio on the other side of the edge. So the edge crossing points of this 20 group, where the edge is divided at the golden ratio, form the 30 vertexes of a special Archimedean solid called the icosododecahedron, which has icosahedral symmetry. And so the representative polytope of the quasi-crystalline spin network is the icosododecahedron in this sense.
Right. So the reverse of what he's talking about, he takes the dodecahedron is the dual of the icosahedron. And what that means is if I take every triangular face of the icosa and I extend it equally with the same edge length, I got a tetrahedron sitting on top of this. So in this form, when I build all of these up and I connect that form, it gives me pentagons.
Mm-hmm.
And if I take the pentagonal face and I do the same thing, I draw a star up from that, it gives me an icosahedron. And this duality continues to infinity.
That's
right?
the shape up there, right? The icosahedron.
The icosahedron. So if I take this icosahedron, which has 5 edges coming to a vertex,
Mm-hmm.
if I cut through that, I get a pentagon,
Yes.
right? So his model can be built either coming from a quasi-crystal projection, 20 tetrahedra, twisted, there's the Fibonacci sequence and all of that, right? Which is essentially an Archimedean. That's what Archimedes did. You chop off all of these, you get the icosadodeca, because you're combining both the pentagons of the dodeca and the triangles of the icosa. Yeah. And they are intertransformable. If I keep on expanding the triangle, I end at pentagons. If I keep on expanding the pentagons, I end at triangle.
When he does his, you've got to intersect the triangles at a point to find Fibonacci. You have to intersect at a point where for them to connect there is quite unstable in my perspective. But if you look at that icosahedron you have there, that has the Fibonacci sequence in it already.
This is in fact what we call a phi sphere. This is a Fibonacci sphere because there are 6 of these opposite edges to each other, right? Up and down, right and left, and straight through like this. And every one of those, if I connect up from here to there, this is a Fibonacci rectangle. The Fibonacci rectangle comes naturally out of the icosahedron, but it does not exist in the form called the cube octahedron, which is this form, which is the basis of our model of the tetraverse, because this comes out of an original tetrahedron. Whoops, got the folding down. There we go. And as Klee Irwin points out in his thing, I can twist this right and I can twist it left. But if I twist it right all the way down, sorry, if I twist it so that I bring it down to this stage, it stops at an octahedron. I cannot compress it any further.
Yeah.
So if I release it and I turn in the opposite direction, I can compress it all the way down to a tetrahedron.
Right. And so there's the left-handedness and right-handedness naturally, inherently in the tetraverse.
Exactly. And in this model, you need both. It's an oscillation, right? Mm-hmm. They're moving from cube octahedron, which is, we'll talk infinite expansion, to an icosahedron, which then brings you to Fibonacci constraints for life.
Yeah, and that movement, just to be specific, the reason you're moving from the cube octahedron to the icosa and not any further is because you're saying each of the square sides of the cube octahedron can only distort to the point where the cross section is a Planck length, because you can't be shorter than the Planck length.
Exactly. So that constrains the oscillation. You can't just go all the way. It constrains the oscillation into this kind of a movement. Now, if we think about the density of a planet or the density of a star, you're now talking about a different compressive force.
Okay.
As an example, let's say that this is no gravity. This is kind of the vacuum of space, right? Not no gravity, but there's no object in here in order to kind of distort it, right? Well, whereas in this situation, as an example, this might be a planetary density, right? Einstein, the space itself is compressed around the mass of the object. So what would be something more massive than a planet, a big planet? Let's say the sun or star. Now we have a complete different transform again, right? And that's a phase shift, right? You don't just go from a planet to a sun. You need a different configuration of the same geometric model in order to do that. And essentially, if I compress this all the way down to what's called a triangle, this would be the representation of a black hole. The minimum compression, because you cannot compress this any further without breaking it.
You're also no longer in 3D space. It's sort of flat space at that point.
You're now into a two-dimensional space, in fact, and you kind of think, well, that's what the black hole does. It sucks the dimensions down to this very, very small space, but you can't get it to suck down any further than this without completely breaking it apart, which would just distribute all particles and so on into a random kind of sense. So one of the things that we're saying is that the representation of the icosahedron that they build, loop quantum gravity builds out of 20 tetrahedron that go together, our model starts with the 8 tetrahedra that come to the center of this form, and that is what creates the square spaces. Why? Because this is the only object where the radius and the edge are the same, right? And if in fact loop quantum gravity is right, that the edge of a tetrahedron is the Planck distance or constant, then this object is the smallest Planck object because the radius is the smallest radius that you can have in an object that meets the Planck criteria.
Excellent. Right? And I just want to end with this very quickly because I think
that's lovely.
Yeah, because when Klee started talking about Fibonacci, which is essential for life as we know it, and doing the math where that Fibonacci sequence is essential, one of the key things about the icosahedron is it is 3 orthogonal intersecting
golden
rectangles. Yeah. And so the Fibonacci sequence is here as well. So I think the premise that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that the premise is that we live in a tetraverse. And if we start with that fundamental shape and we look at moving, as you build a multi-frequency tetrahedral shape and you get to 4 frequencies, innately within that is built your cube octahedron. And that shape can structurally expand continually.
That's right.
To develop our flat universe. And then when you squeeze that to form an icosahedron.
Compressing the sphere. And again, you have to turn either right or left to get that to compress. Right? Because you're not shorting the edges. You're not bringing it together by shorting the edges. You're bringing them together by rotating them to each other.
Which structurally works within our 3D universe with us looking fundamentally at the geometry that we exist in and not looking at other dimensions in order to make that work.
Right, because all those other dimensions give us the 3 dimensions that we measure everything in. The Large Hadron Collider, right? Yeah, you can talk about 10 or 11 dimensions, but what they see in there is what's happening in our 3-dimensional realm. So I'm not disputing the fact that there are other dimensions. We're saying those are not the necessary primitives to deal with. They give you reflections that give you mathematical meaning, but in fact, what they're representing is the 3D space that we can show you directly. The other thing about this is the grid, right? The famous matrix. You see the movie of the Matrix is all cubical. The whole construct is based on cubes. Saying, no, right? Get the tetrahedra that are fitted inside those cubes, go off in another plane, right? But they're completely together. Everything you put in your cubicle, I can give you in a tetrahedral structure at greater resolution.
Greater resolution,
So
yes.
we say is that the real number line of mathematics based on the edge length of a cube, because they're building cubicles in 90 degrees, if we complement that with a 4-axis tetrahedral axis, they fit completely together. And now I have a line, another real number line, that's a tetrahedral line that runs completely along relation to the real number line of mathematics, right?
Yes.
But if we start with that unit 1 principle, that nothing can be smaller than that tetrahedral edge, we have a discrete mathematics on that number line. Because when I go from 1 to 2, that's not divisible. 2 is divisible into 1 by half, etc. But you cannot divide any one of those numbers, whereas in our mathematical real number line, the distance between 0 and 1 is infinite. You can break it up into an infinite number of infinitesimals, and you can expand it to infinity. And that, to me, just simply violates logic of living in a finite universe, right? And in math, they say infinity, but you're starting from 0. Infinity can't start. You're either infinite or you're not. And so you're giving me a line that represents what to you is infinite, something that never ends, but it's not infinity, right? The mathematical infinity is a construct that allows us to do higher order mathematics, which brings us to that universal question: is math discovered or invented? And what we show in our theory of Book of Codes is that you can discover mathematics, all the operations, by looking at how a wave travels along a line. But to invent other mathematics, you have these other infinities that you deal with. And the proof of that is that every mathematical object is not a real object. Every real object can be described in mathematics. That's a claim I can accept. Everything you find can be described in mathematics, but I can describe shit in mathematics that has nothing to do with physical reality. So the universe is a subset of the mathematical universe. So in the ontological cosmological frame, people like Max Tegmark, who believe the universe is mathematical. It's a mathematical structure, right? What we're saying is that that's an invention, right? The actual physical universe to us is finite. And so if we describe that finite universe in the discrete mathematics, we believe that we could ameliorate, if not get rid of, the infinities that plague the Einstein relativity models and that plague trying to bring relativity and quantum mechanics together, right? There's a huge disparity between those two systems. The cosmic Einstein relativity system is people call it a theory, but at this point you cannot disprove it. It is one of the most proven theories in existence. And in the quantum world, computers and lasers, it's the same thing. It's undisputable in terms of the things that we get. We're getting computers and lasers out of this stuff, but these two systems don't talk to each other. And what we're saying is that there's a frame that is possible for us to bring those two, what seems to be conflicting frames, together. And one thing I need to point out, a very simple diagram. Start with a triangle. Call one edge of the triangle your unit 1, which says nothing can be smaller. So when I build a cube, I'm going to build a cube using that same edge length. If I put these two structures together, infinities occur. You can't put those two structures together meaningfully where they cancel each other out into real numbers, right? So the universe presents you, right, with the motivation to invent mathematics that can actually describe what it is doing, right? But it is doing something physical. It's matter, it's evolution. These are things that we can test, 13.7 billion years. And we do not need infinities. And in fact, when infinities occur in mathematics, throw it away. It's like dividing by 0, right? It is meaningless. And what we're saying here is we're changing the cubic real edge length. If that's 1, the diagonal, which is our tetrahedral length, is root 2. If we take the tetrahedral length, the diagonal, as 1, The cubical edge becomes irrational, but I don't need that. I'm dealing with unit 1 of the discrete mathematics of physical quantum space.
Excellent. Yeah. Wonderful.
Okay.
We'll end there.
Okay.